Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters, and friends. For years now, advocacy groups, activists, and academics have been met with a wall of secrecy when petitioning the government to release the science behind their counter-terrorism and counter-extremism strategy. A few months ago, however, advocacy group Cage came across a journal article hidden away in a niche journal in the United States. It is this article that has formed the basis of a shocking report released today by Cage, entitled The Science of Pre-Crime. Islam 21C carried out an exclusive interview with the research director for Cage, Asim Qureshi, to explain the report's findings and their significance.
Okay, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, Asim. Good to have you here. You've today released a new report, The Science of Pre-Crime. Do you want to tell me a little bit about the story behind the report?
Well, effectively it starts a couple of years ago. We found out about something called the ERG22+, the Extremism Risk Guidance. And what we found out was that this guidance was being used in order to measure how individuals become drawn towards terrorism. So what are the factors? And 22 was very specific as well. We didn't really know much about it. So last year we released a joint letter. We worked alongside many other academics and professionals and released a kind of a letter condemning Prevent, saying that Prevent doesn't work anymore, it's having a chilling effect on academic life and culture, and so it should be scrapped completely. What was interesting about that joint letter, other than the fact that we had 300 academics signing it, was the Home Office response, the UK Home Office's response to us. What they said is actually it's not, Prevent isn't so simplistic. We don't just look for people's religion or overt kind of manifestations of religious practice, but there's multiple set of factors that are used to understand how radicalization works. And there's 22 of these factors. And these are used to kind of, train frontline staff such as doctors, nurses, teachers, so on and so forth. So I remember at the time thinking, 22 is very, very specific. So it must link to that ERG22+. And then when we looked through the government's documentation, we found that actually they do have 22 factors, quite literally. Things like being at a transient phase of life and having a desire for moral or political change.
So these 22 factors were they were publicly available?
Just the factors were available, right, but nothing else.
Because these would have been the 22 factors upon which Prevent training was built. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, something called Channel is built, yes.
Right.
But what we found out later, and we can discuss that, is that Prevent has actually incorporated this into the way in which these frontline employees, these public sector workers, are supposed to spot the signs of radicalization as well. So, we tried to find this, how do you know that these 22 factors exist? Because that's the first question you ask. If the government says, we have 22 factors that tell us this is how radicalization works, my first question is, well, how do you know that? Give us the evidence, So that's what we went looking for. And when we tried to find it, we found out that it was classified, that the study itself is being held under national security. You can't access it. And that's really when, we tried many efforts to find the study. We never were able to. But what we did find is last year, the authors of the study, they were two psychologists working in the Home Office in a kind of a small department called the National Offenders Management Service, NOMS. They produced a journal article in a very niche journal in America as part of the American Psychological Association. You would never have found it unless you were looking for it. But last year they published this journal where they summarize the findings of their research. And that's what we then critiqued. So working with 18 independent reviewers, they're all experts in their field. We went through their research, this journal article they produced, and what we found out is actually basically Prevent and Channel, the science behind their theory of radicalization, it's a scandal, because it would never have passed the profession, the psychology profession's ethical standards, had it been open to wider critique.
Okay, you mentioned that there are the report that you've published today has been peer-reviewed by 18 academics. Do you mind mentioning who some of these are?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
the expertise is.
It's written in the report. For us, the first thing was to really get the the acceptance of the psychology community. So we worked with 3 or 4 different psychologists. I mean, the chief of whom was Professor Katerina Kinval. She edits a very well-respected journal called Political Psychology. In fact, it's one of the most well-respected psychology journals there are. So she actually reviewed our document and was very pleased with our findings, made some suggestions and corrections, as well as other psychologists as well. But then further than that, we've got people like Professor Arun Kundnani from New York University, who's written probably one of the best books there is on Prevent. Professor David Miller, who's done superb work kind of deconstructing Prevent and British counter-terrorism policy. So there are a number of experts coming from criminology, sociology, law, psychology, all of them with an expertise around counter-terrorism policy, reviewing our document and saying, yes, we're willing to put our name to this critique of the government's policy.
So Asim, if I could just roll back a little bit, can you just explain the term? So you're going to be using the report uses a term, this phrase, not even a phrase, ERG 22. So what does that mean? You said it's 22 factors. The ERG
ERG means extremism risk guidance. Right. So this is a psychological tool that's used in order to assess whether or not somebody is susceptible to radicalization. So these 22 plus factors are giving us training. They're supposed to be, the original study said only to train professionals, but what we found is that it's been rolled out to public sector workers, to people like teachers and doctors, and they all are told that these 22 factors effectively are the ways in which you spot whether or not an individual is kind of succumbing to radicalization.
So the government, when you publish when this letter sort of questioning the not just the validity perhaps, but the how wise and how useful Prevent is, the government came out with this response, the Home Office. I think you said. So are they in essence saying that they justify their Prevent strategy on these criteria, or is it a little bit more?
Their entire premise of Prevent is that they can stop people in what they term the pre-criminal space. That's not our terminology. This is in their own documentation. They talk about pre-crime. So they say, we're not into criminalizing people. We want to make sure we're able to stop people before they become criminal, right? So, once again, the question came, well, how do you know? How do you know this is a matter of science,
like trying to,
that this is possible? And it's through this ERG process, through these 22 factors, that they say that they're able to predict future behavior. Right. Okay, and that's what we took issue with in relation to this report. How scientific is this process? How accurate is it? And what's interesting is that the authors themselves in this journal article, they say that our model has no predictive validity.
Right. Yeah. Because just on a purely sort of non-specialist, but speaking intuitively, the idea of sort of predicting crimes seems a little bit absurd. You've never heard of a set of psychological criteria for predicting theft or murder or rape,
unless you're a avid fan of Philip K. Dick, read I've seen Minority Report.
It does seem absurd, doesn't it? Because why is this one particular crime and now has this built up again? There would seem like there's something behind that. There's if for thousands of years people have been committing crimes, and for however many years we've had the scientific discipline of psychology, up until now, nobody's managed to come up with...
Well, they did try before in the past. So in America, with death penalty, they invented a science called future dangerousness, where for 40 years they claimed that they were able to predict whether or not somebody would go on to be to commit more offences and to be violent if they were released back into society. And during sentencing hearings, that was used in order to tell the judge that this person should be executed, because if we did release them eventually, they would go on in the future to kill. So 40 years, they killed hundreds of people, executed hundreds of people based on this future dangerousness psychology. And when they finally did an open review, psychological critique of future dangerousness, they found it was as accurate as finding a random person in the street and asking them if somebody randomly pointed out was going to commit a crime in the future. That was the degree of accuracy that it had. So psychology is no stranger to fraudulent or pseudoscience. This has happened again and again. Look, I understand.
Which would be important. Why the study? Because you mentioned it's an article, but as a peer-reviewed article, there are some problems with this. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, for us, the standard is always looking at the data sets themselves, right? If you're saying you've
so this is by data set you mean the sort of the actual numbers in essence.
So how do they come to these conclusions? They talk about that a little bit, but without releasing their data. They said that they had an imperfect methodology because they were trying to interview what they termed as Al-Qaeda influenced extremist offenders, who they acknowledge also many of whom weren't involved in violent crime. So they used these people in prison, and many of whom had no intention of being involved in violence. They had been charged and convicted because they had, say, for example, a publication in their household, which was considered an offence. So based on largely case notes from these people, initially the sample was 20, then it went up to 40, but it's a very small sample. They looked at these convicted offenders and then extrapolated a predictive model for the whole of society. So you're taking a very small sample in an environment that that isn't reflective of wider society and applying it to the whole of society. So this is why we have a major problem, not only with the methodology, but with the data sets as well, because what you want to see is a longitudinal research as well. So, okay, you did this exercise, by which I mean that, okay, you do this review with the offenders, but then you should do similar types of reviews with non-offenders as well, as a test case for your modeling, right? But they didn't do any of that, or at least it's not indicated in their journal piece. So there are so many problems just purely from an academic perspective. You don't have to be an expert in psychology.
On one point you mentioned in there, this idea of extending the scope of the research, the applicability, utility of the research beyond the initial limited scope. Is that, do the authors of the study, do they make it explicit how limited they feel the scope of the study is, and on whose recommendations then has the government gone on to essentially expand the applicability of this research on a wider level? So do they justify finally? Do they have any justification for that?
So they acknowledge themselves that they don't have any adequate validity for their modelling, which is obviously where it becomes quite bizarre, because you've produced a study, okay, that you in 2016, the most recent thing that they wrote on it was in the summer of 2016, and in that they still call it a work in progress. So 6 years after you produced the study, you're still calling it a work in progress, but the government took the study of these authors and placed it at a statutory level. So they made it mandatory for the whole of the public sector to implement these factors, when even the authors themselves are saying that, well, it's a work in progress. We haven't actually kind of refined it. It doesn't have that degree of validity. So this is why it's such a scandal, because the government has forced this through into the Prevent and the Channel programs, is forcing teachers and doctors to play this role of spotting the signs of radicalization when the science itself is so drastically flawed. And that is our issue with this entire situation. And that's why it's such a scandal, and that's why people should be angry about this, because when you have 4,000 prevent referrals in just last year alone, most of whom are children. Okay, so these are kids who are being reported by their teachers, by their doctors to prevent. Okay, then based on this false science, and that is an issue, because they say it's not about criminalization, but as soon as there is a file on somebody, that is criminalization. As soon as the police keep a file on you, anywhere, even if you're not convicted on something, you have been through a process of criminalization. And that's what they don't understand.
Okay, so, I mean, you touched on a point in what you were just mentioning that I'd like to expand. But before we do that, you already then now elaborated for us one of your conclusions, which is that there isn't enough evidence to support this. The evidence at the moment is insufficient, and also that the conclusions of this study have been implemented far beyond the scope of what the authors originally intended.
That's correct.
Your final conclusion, which you alluded there, is this idea, which if you could expand on a bit more, focusing a bit more on this idea specifically, that the tools or the criteria set out in this study are suggested to be used by you could say expert practitioners, and in reality what's happening is anybody who is in an area where they're dealing with supposedly vulnerable people without adequate psychological training is expected to use these tools. Is that something that you found to be the case? And if so, why is it problematic?
So look, if we try and kind of make it simple to understand, there is a case possibly to be made, but even this is controversial, okay, that if you've got a violent offender, let's not talk about extremists or anything, if you've got a violent offender, you maybe want some kind of marker to understand if this person was released from prison, do they pose a threat to society if they're released, right? So you have to have some kind of measure in order to be able to assess that.
Right.
Okay, so if the study was restricted to that, it may still have been understandable. But the problem is that they've gone so much further than that, right? What they're saying is that we looked at that model of predicting future offending, but we looked at non-offenders, people like children, like 6-7-year-olds, and we looked at whether or not they were at risk through these factors of potentially offending in the future. Okay, that goes well beyond anything that was ever envisaged, right? By this study, by the original study itself. Okay, so there is a major issue that we have here in relation to the way that this whole thing has been constructed, and the fact that the government has used the work of these authors, and we don't place the blame of the authors. There's plenty of pseudo academics everywhere, okay, who produce all types of science that isn't necessarily that credible, okay. But the fact that the government took this and placed it at a level that makes it mandatory on doctors and teachers to effectively spy on those that are under their charge, that is a major issue. And of course, the ultimate result of that, and this is what people like Professor Mark Sageman, who looked at our report, and he signed a joint letter that was published in The Guardian, kind of criticizing this entire program. He said that you're effectively going to cause about the very thing that you're trying to avoid, that this will actually lead to more people feeling disenfranchised and alienated from society, and effectively potentially become offenders in the future, rather than the reverse.
Right. So in addition to the report as it is, you have accompanying it this joint letter. So can you tell us a little bit more about that joint letter?
Yes, the joint letter is a joint effort. It's not necessarily a caged thing, but it was a group of people coming together saying that we have a problem with the ERG process, the science, the fact that it exists in the first place, the fact that it hasn't been opened up to public scrutiny, that psychologists, the wider psychologist community, hasn't been able to critique it in an open and transparent way, and that the government should kind of make an effort to release the data sets so it can be given that degree of scrutiny. But ultimately, we know that if they did, then it wouldn't stand the test of the community's kind of scrutiny. So we had many academics from different disciplines across the world kind of raising awareness about this, because Prevent, while it's a UK-based program, is really the founding father of countering violent extremism programs around the world, CVE programs. So America has a version of Prevent, CVE.
Oh, really? Is that the case?
And the Security Council last year made it mandatory on every single country in the world to have a version of Prevent, or what they term CVE. So we know that the efforts that we make here in the UK impact upon the rest of the world, and that's why we had a lot of academics from America also joining up. But these people are also experts in their field. So people like Professor Arun Kudnani, Professor Mark Sageman, who is a former CIA psychiatrist, signing this letter saying that this is going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. And of course, the Royal College of Psychiatry just last month, or this month actually, earlier this month, they issued their own statement saying that the ERG tool should be open to wider scrutiny and critique.
So this particular tool, ERG 22+, how is it being implemented? In which fields and which areas is it actually being implemented?
So it's supposed to be implemented in the Channel program. So what's supposed to happen is referrals are supposed to be made to Channel, and then Channel, which is the de-radicalization program that the UK has, okay? The Channel officers make an assessment based on the ERG as to whether or not the individual is prone or susceptible to radicalization. But by that stage, they've already come into the system, they've already got a file on them, they've already been reported on. But what we found actually is that it starts earlier than that. The ERG, the 22 factors, are used in order to train those frontline staff. Okay, so while the government says actually ERG is really about Channel, in reality, it appears at the very first stage, because those factors, that this whole process of radicalization that they say exists, has been used to justify these prevent referrals. So these teachers and doctors and nurses making these referrals to prevent officers in the first place.
Okay, and then I guess following on from that is, have there been any legal decisions? Has it had any actual legal impact?
Yes, absolutely, and that's probably the matter of gravest concern, because we've been following a line of cases where, just as an example, Muslim children have been taken away from Muslim families, with the judges clearly recognizing in their judgments that they know how radicalization works based on the ERG. So they quote it specifically in some instances, or generally saying that Channel, gives us an exact science for how radicalization works. And they rely upon that process, that methodology, in order to justify taking children away from their families, because they say they're at risk. So there are huge implications. And we believe that there are close to 30 cases where this has taken place in the UK right now. And so, for us, this isn't just an abstract thing. The whole point about the ERG and holding it to account is that it has very real-world consequences in the lives of communities, and it's important we hold that to account.
So, on the basis of this, so was the study commissioned by the government?
Yeah. So they were two employees.
It wasn't something they went to go off they didn't have the idea, apply for some kind of funding.
No,
it's been actually pushed, right?
No, they were employees.
Do you think the government actually commissioned this in a way to almost provide some kind of more rigorous, academically rigorous justification for prevent? Because I guess, I don't know how you'd link this exactly to, in my mind, when I think, so I have a limited acquaintance with prevent and counter-terrorism policy, and there's this idea, isn't it, of the conveyor belt theory.
That's right.
So the government's proceeded now, it's gone down steps to get to the point where now it's not just violent extremists who've committed a crime or shown clear evidence they're about to commit a crime that are a problem. It's actually thinking certain thoughts, having a certain worldview automatically now puts you in a category where you're criminalized, okay?
That's exactly right.
That's the sort of conveyor belt theory. You adopt as an Islamist worldview, you're much more likely to go on and blow something up, which of course has been completely. I would say, I was on camera, I was going to say poo-pooed, but it has, because it is literally that, isn't it? It's a load of rubbish.
Yes. This is
almost like a kind of a retrospective attempt to. Do you think there's some? Is that possibly why?
Absolutely. In our view, what they've done is that they've realised that they had to have a narrative. They couldn't just run with the conveyor belt theory anymore, and so they use the ERG in order to justify how it is that radicalization works. So what you'll find is, for example, groups like the Quilliam Foundation will talk about, nobody talks about the conveyor belt theory anymore, actually. If you look at the government documents, they talk about radicalization being multifaceted, so on and so forth, right? So they use this documentation, even though they've never scrutinized it themselves. They don't know what the science is themselves, but as a justification for saying that we know how radicalization works. Well, actually you don't, because you never looked at the science, so you're just taking the government's word for it that it works this way. Okay.
So on the basis of this deconstruction of this study in your report, what do you think the government should do? What do you want the government?
Well, ultimately, our call has always been the same, which is prevent has to end. It's a program that's destructive. It harms communities from top to bottom, and not just ours, also other communities as well. And communities that are concerned with animal rights, environmental rights, so on and so forth. They're all judged by these same markers. So it's not just about Muslims; it's much further than that. But specifically in relation to this project, what we're saying to the government is that open the ERG to scrutiny. You can't hide behind walls of secrecy, claiming national security, when the resulting science behind what you produce is so harmful to so many different communities in the UK. And that's really what our call is. It's just about accountability and transparency, something that seems to be very alien to this government in particular.
Okay. Thank you very much, Asim.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please click the link below to read a copy of the report for yourself. And please share with your friends, colleagues, and members of Parliament.